A wild horse appeared every dawn outside a bankrupt farmer's ranch, until it led him to a secret that would change everything. The story begins on a foggy Montana morning, where Daniel Brooks, an aging farmer drowning in debt, spots a white mustang watching him from the edge of the woods. Drawn by something he can't explain, he follows the creature into the forest and uncovers a truth buried in time, family, and silence. The wind moved across the plains of Montana like an old whisper, soft, endless, and tired. It rattled the rusted tin roof of Daniel Brooks's barn, carrying with it the faint smell of thawing earth and forgotten winters. Daniel stood on his porch, his fingers rough and cracked, holding a faded notice from the bank. Final warning. The red stamp bled through the paper like an open wound. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the dull clatter of Lily's suitcase. She moved between the small kitchen and her room, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I can't live like this anymore, Dad," she said, her voice calm but hard. "There's nothing here but dust and debt." Daniel didn't answer. He had heard the same words before, from neighbors who'd sold their land, from his own reflection in the mirror. Outside, the fields lay still under patches of melting snow, fences broken, and cattle thin from winter. Every corner of the farm carried the weight of time. He walked toward the corral, boots sinking into the wet ground. For years, this place had been his anchor, the soil where he had buried his youth, his dreams, and the ghost of his brother, Michael, who'd left decades ago and never come back. The wind shifted. From the edge of the pine forest, something moved, a shimmer of white among the trees. Daniel narrowed his eyes. A horse. Wild. Its coat gleamed pale against the gray sky, its mane streaked with silver like frost. It stood still, watching him, too calm to be startled, too real to be imagined. He whispered, half to himself, "Where did you come from?" The horse didn't move. It only blinked once, then turned its head toward the forest, as if gesturing. Then it disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of prints on the wet soil. When Daniel turned back to the house, Lily was standing in the doorway with her coat zipped and her backpack slung over her shoulder. "What are you staring at?" she asked. "There was a horse," he said. "A white one. Out there." She glanced toward the trees and gave a small, tired laugh. "Dad, there's no wild horses left around here. Maybe it's time you stopped chasing ghosts." He looked back at the forest. The trees swayed gently, but the tracks were still there, pressed deep into the mud. He could feel something stirring inside. A pull. Quiet, but insistent, like the sound of his brother's laughter long ago. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old photograph of two boys with matching cowboy hats, him and Michael, grinning in front of the same barn that now stood half-collapsed behind the house. Lily ate in silence, her phone glowing between her hands. "You remember your uncle's paintings?" Daniel asked suddenly. She looked up, confused. "Barely. Mom used to say he left because he couldn't stand this life." "Maybe," Daniel murmured. "Or maybe he was looking for something else." "Like what?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Freedom." Lily gave a small sigh. "Well, I'm looking for the same thing, but I don't need to run into the woods to find it." He didn't argue. The years had taught him that silence often said more than anger ever could. When she went to bed, Daniel stayed by the window. the lamp casting a tired glow over the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the fields stretched endless beneath a bruised sky. Then he saw it again. The white horse, standing at the same edge of the forest, moonlight running down its back like water. This time, it turned slightly, waiting. Daniel's breath caught. He opened the door quietly and stepped into the night. The air smelled of pine and melting snow. Somewhere behind him, Lily's voice called faintly, "Dad? Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He followed the prints that led toward the dark trees, the wind whispering through the branches as though carrying a message from another world. The forest swallowed him whole. The forest greeted Daniel with a hush so deep it swallowed every sound, except his own breath. Moonlight sifted through the pines in broken shards, illuminating the faint trail of hoofprints ahead. The ground was soft with thawing snow, releasing the scent of damp soil and pine needles, the smell of a world beginning again. Each step he took seemed to echo in a place where time had slowed to a whisper. He walked until the lights of the farmhouse disappeared behind him. The horse appeared again, pale and ghost-like between the trees, watching him from a distance. When Daniel stopped, it moved forward, not away. Its eyes caught the moonlight, not wild, not tame, but something older, deeper, like memory itself. "Easy there," Daniel murmured, his voice soft, almost reverent. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mustang flicked its ears, then turned, walking deeper into the forest. Daniel followed without thinking, guided by instinct rather than reason. Somewhere in the stillness, the cold crept under his coat, but he didn't care. There was a strange pull, like a thread connecting him to that creature. And beyond it, to something he couldn't name. Back at the farm, Lily woke to the sound of the door creaking in the wind. Her father was gone. She hesitated for a moment, anger flashing across her face, but it was quickly replaced by worry. She threw on her jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and followed the faint trail of her father's boot prints. In the woods, Daniel lost sight of the horse for a moment, then found it again standing beside a shallow stream, its reflection broken by ripples. The water shimmered under the moonlight, and the horse dipped its head to drink. Daniel crouched nearby, mesmerized. He thought of Michael again, his brother's voice, his laughter, the way he used to hum while painting. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind him. Daniel turned and saw Lily, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Dad, what the hell are you doing out here?" He blinked, startled, but relief crossed his face. "You shouldn't have come." "You shouldn't have left," she shot back. Her breath turned to mist in the cold air. "You scared me." He wanted to tell her that he couldn't explain what drew him here, that the horse wasn't just an animal, but a message. Something sacred, like a sign. But the words stuck in his throat. The horse watched them both, still and silent, before stepping across the stream and disappearing once again into the dark. Lily groaned. "Great! You chased a horse into the woods. Now what? You think it's some kind of miracle?" Daniel didn't answer. He walked to where the horse had crossed. The air there felt different, colder, heavier, as if something ancient lived beneath the soil. The stream bubbled quietly, winding through the forest toward a deeper shadow that looked almost like a path. "I'm going to follow it," Daniel said quietly. Lily stared at him. "Are you serious? It's 2 a.m. "I have to," he said. "It's leading somewhere." Lily exhaled hard, shaking her head. You've finally lost it. But as she looked around at the towering pines and the faint prints leading away, something inside her shifted. A strange curiosity, a memory of stories her father used to tell her about freedom, about wild horses that no one could ever tame. Against her better judgment, she sighed. Fine, but if we get lost, it's on you. They walked together in silence, the beam of her flashlight trembling with each step. The path curved through thick underbrush and opened suddenly into a clearing where the snow had melted completely. The ground was bare, covered in pine needles and moss. In the center stood an old wooden fence, half collapsed, with a single weathered gate leaning open. Ghost stood just beyond it, framed by the pale glow of dawn beginning to touch the horizon. The Mustang's breath formed clouds in the cold air, its mane catching the first light like silver threads. Daniel froze, his throat tightening. It's waiting, he whispered. Lily turned to him, incredulous. Waiting for what? For us, he said. Before she could respond, Ghost turned again and trotted through the trees, its white tail vanishing like mist. But now they could both see it clearly. A narrow path winding deeper into the forest, as if carved by hooves and time. The first birds began to sing, their notes fragile and bright. Daniel looked at his daughter, exhaustion and awe blending in his face. Just a little farther, he said softly. We'll see where it goes. Lily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Together they stepped through the broken gate, following the fading light of the horse as the forest opened its arms wider. Behind them, the first warmth of sunrise touched the plains, a promise, or perhaps a warning, carried on the wind. Morning seeped through the forest in thin threads of gold, touching the bark of the pines and the steam rising from the thawing ground. Daniel and Lily walked quietly, their breath visible in the chill. The only sounds were the crunch of wet leaves and the distant call of a raven. The trail ahead twisted between the trees, faint but unmistakable, as though carved by generations of hooves that had passed this way before. Lily's flashlight had died hours ago, replaced now by the first soft light of dawn. She rubbed her arms for warmth, her voice low. I don't know why we're still following it. Maybe the horse was just lost. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the ground, tracing each set of hoofprints like words on a forgotten page. Some things don't get lost, he said at last. They just wait to be found. She frowned, but said nothing. The forest felt alive, not threatening but ancient, breathing slowly around them. The air carried a sweetness of pine and damp moss, the kind of scent that made Daniel remember summers long gone, riding with Michael through open fields, chasing wild mustangs until the horizon swallowed them. They reached a ridge where the trees opened, revealing a sweeping view of the Bitterroot Mountains. Streams of mist curled between the peaks, and the valley below shimmered with melted snow. Lily stopped, her eyes softening despite herself. I forgot how beautiful it is, she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. You used to call it the land of forever skies. You were 6. She turned to look at him, a flicker of guilt passing through her expression. People change, Dad. Dreams, too. Yeah, he said quietly, but the sky doesn't. The wind rose, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves, distant but rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the earth. Both of them turned. Between the trees on the far side of the ridge, they caught a glimpse of movement. Ghost, the white horse, walking slowly, head lowered, as if making sure they followed. See? Daniel whispered, a touch of awe in his tone. He's leading us. Lily crossed her arms. Or maybe he's just wandering. You're giving it too much meaning. Maybe, he said, and began walking again. But meaning's all we've got left, isn't it? They descended the ridge into a valley thick with mist. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Birds flitted between branches overhead, and drops of melted snow fell like small pearls from the needles. After a while, Lily began to hum softly. Old lullaby her mother used to sing. Daniel glanced back, surprised, but didn't interrupt. There was a gentleness in that sound that reminded him of everything they'd lost, but hadn't yet said out loud. They stopped at a stream crossing, where stones jutted out like crooked teeth. Daniel offered his hand, but Lily ignored it, hopping across lightly. See? I can handle it, she said, her voice teasing for the first time in years. He chuckled. Didn't say you couldn't. When he reached the other side, she was staring at something. Ahead, through the thinning mist, rose the faint outline of a small cabin. Its roof sagged, its walls darkened with time. But even from a distance, Daniel felt his chest tighten. He didn't know it yet, but the air around the cabin felt charged, heavy with memory, and something unspoken. Lily tilted her head. You've got to be kidding me. This is what he wanted us to find? Ghost stood in front of the cabin, silent as stone. Its mane moved gently in the breeze, catching the morning light. When Daniel took a step forward, the horse turned its head toward him, then walked away into the trees without looking back. Wait, he called, but the forest swallowed the sound. Dad, Lily said softly. Let it go. It's gone. Daniel didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, the broken window pane, the open door hanging on one hinge. Something in the way the shadows fell made his heart ache. He walked forward slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden porch. Inside, the smell of old timber and dust filled the air. Cobwebs hung like lace across the corners. On a table lay a stack of yellowed papers, a cup with dried paint at the bottom, and a canvas resting against the wall. Lily stepped in behind him, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the room. What is this place? She asked. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes had fallen on the painting, a half-finished landscape of the Montana plains, wild and alive, with the exact same ridge they had just crossed painted beneath a violet sky. His throat closed. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the dry brushstrokes. Michael, he whispered. Lily frowned. Your brother? He nodded slowly. This is his work. I'd know his hand anywhere. Silence filled the cabin like mist. Dust drifted through the sunlight that filtered in through the broken window. Daniel turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The brushes, the worn boots by the door, the coat still hanging on the chair. Every inch of the room felt like time had stopped the moment someone set down their pen and never returned. Lily spoke softly. He was here. All this time? Daniel swallowed hard. Or at least long enough to leave a part of himself behind. A faint creak came from the corner. They both turned. On a wooden desk near the window lay an old leather-bound journal, its edges frayed, a ribbon marking the last page opened. The cover bore the initials M.B. Lily whispered, You think it's his? Daniel nodded. There's only one way to find out. He picked it up carefully, his hands trembling as if he were holding his brother's heartbeat. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and the cabin seemed to exhale. A sound like a sigh, ancient and weary. Daniel opened the journal. The first words, written in faded ink, read, "If anyone ever finds this place, tell my brother I never stopped painting the world we loved." Lily looked at her father, her eyes wide. "Dad." He couldn't speak. The air thickened with something beyond grief, something like forgiveness waiting to be born. Outside, in the distance, the faint echo of hoofbeats faded into the forest, like the ending of a prayer. The air inside the cabin was still, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Dust drifted in slow spirals through the thin light that spilled from the cracked window. Daniel stood motionless, the journal heavy in his hands, the smell of old paint and pine resin surrounding him like a memory that refused to fade. Lily stayed near the doorway, her fingers brushing the frame, as if crossing inside would break something sacred. Daniel turned the first page. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting was unmistakable, strong, deliberate, the same hand that once sketched wild horses on scraps of paper by the firelight decades ago. March 3rd, it read. "The snow hasn't stopped. My body is weaker now. But every morning, I paint until my hands shake. The silence here keeps me company." Maybe that's what I was looking for all along. Quiet that listens back. Daniel's throat tightened. He ran his fingers along the page, following the loops of his brother's words as if they could bridge the years between them. He was alive here, he murmured. All this time. Lily stepped forward slowly, her boots creaking against the warped floorboards. "Dad, are you sure it's him? It could have been someone else who—" "No," Daniel interrupted softly, pointing toward a small wooden box beside the desk. "Look." The box was carved with a pattern of mustangs galloping under a crescent moon, a design Michael had once burned into the side of their childhood barn. Daniel knelt, lifting the lid. Inside were dried tubes of paint, a pocket knife, and a bundle of small sketches tied with string. He untied them carefully. The top drawing made him stop breathing. It was a portrait. Two boys sitting on a fence under a Montana sunset. One of them held a brush, the other a small foal leaning against his leg. Beneath the drawing, in faint pencil, Michael had written, "For Daniel, so you don't forget the light we chased." Lily leaned over his shoulder, her voice breaking. "He drew you." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He stared at the drawing until the lines blurred, then set it gently aside. On the wall hung larger canvases, some finished, others half-painted. They were landscapes, mountain ridges bathed in lavender skies, fields shimmering with gold, and one haunting image of a white horse standing alone on a hill, mane blowing against the wind. "He saw it too," Lily whispered. Daniel looked up. "The horse?" She nodded. "Ghost, or whatever you want to call it." They moved through the cabin slowly, reverently. A kettle still sat on the stove, rusted through. A bed in the corner was covered by a wool blanket stiff with dust. Everything felt preserved, as if Michael had stepped out for a walk and never returned. Daniel lifted a small frame from the nightstand, a faded photograph of their parents, smiling in front of the old ranch house. His hands trembled so hard that Lily reached out to steady him. "Dad," she said softly, "you should sit down." He shook his head. "I can't. Not yet." He turned back to the journal and flipped toward the end. The final entry was written in uneven script, the ink darker, heavier. April 10th. The fever's worse today. But I'm not afraid. I've seen things no one would believe. The way the snow glows blue before sunrise, the horses that appear and vanish like wind. If Daniel ever finds this place, tell him I stayed because I finally learned that freedom doesn't mean leaving. It means seeing beauty, even in the loneliness. Daniel closed the journal, pressing it to his chest. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. He wasn't lost. He just found his peace in a different way. Lily stood silent, her face softening. For the first time, she didn't see her father as a man stubbornly clinging to the past, but as someone who had spent a lifetime searching for pieces of it. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing through the pines with a low sigh. The door creaked gently on its hinge, opening wider as if inviting them to look beyond. Lily walked to the window. Through the shifting trees, she could see Ghost standing at a distance once more. The horse's coat glowed pale against the shadows, its head slightly bowed. "Dad," she said quietly. "He's back." Daniel stepped beside her. For a long moment, they simply watched the horse. The air between them felt different now, no longer filled with accusation or silence, but something fragile and shared. "He led us here for a reason," Daniel said. Lily glanced at him, skeptical but curious. "You really think an animal knew about any of this?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but maybe he knew we needed to." Ghost raised its head, ears flicking toward the sound of the wind, then turned slowly and disappeared into the woods again. Daniel rested his hand on the window frame. "It's time we go home," he said softly. "Home?" Lily asked. "Yeah." He looked around the small cabin one last time. The canvases, the sketches, the quiet air that still held his brother's spirit. "There's something I have to do first." He carefully gathered the drawings and the journal, wrapping them in a worn cloth. Then, before stepping outside, he turned back once more and whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, Michael." The forest answered with the sound of wind through the pines, like an old voice saying goodbye. When they stepped into the daylight, the snow had almost completely melted. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, pale blue and full of promise. As they began the long walk back through the forest, Lily slipped her hand into her father's. For the first time in years, he didn't pull away. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything they had both finally begun to understand. The road back to the farm wound through the forest like a slow, forgotten song. The morning had ripened into pale sunlight, and the air smelled of thawing earth and pine sap. Daniel carried the bundle of sketches and the journal under his arm, as though they were made of glass. Lily walked beside him in silence, her eyes lowered, her breath soft and steady. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence felt different now. Warmer, less like a wall, and more like a bridge slowly being built between them. When they reached the edge of the woods, the plain opened wide, and the Brooks farm came into view, familiar and weary, yet somehow changed. The fences still leaned, the barn still sagged, but the light fell across it differently, casting the land in shades of forgiveness. Daniel stopped for a moment, his boots sinking into the damp ground. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "your uncle would have loved this light." Lily looked up, brushing her hair from her face. "He saw the world in color, didn't he?" Daniel smiled faintly. even when it was gray. They entered the house, the old door groaning in protest. Inside, Daniel set the bundle carefully on the kitchen table. The silence of the cabin still clung to him, its stillness, its breath of memory. He opened the journal again. The pages rustled softly, the ink faded but alive. He read aloud. April 2nd. Sometimes the wind brings voices from the valley. Laughter, music, things I thought I'd forgotten. Maybe memory is the only company the lonely ever need. He stopped. Lily sat across from him, her chin resting on her hand. He wrote like a poet, she said quietly. He painted the same way, Daniel replied. Every stroke was something he couldn't say. They turned the pages together. There were sketches between the entries, rough drawings of the forest, of the mountains, of a white horse standing under a crescent moon. Lily traced her finger along one of the sketches, whispering, "Ghost." Daniel nodded. "I think that horse found him too. Maybe it's been carrying his spirit all this time." Lily gave him a look, half disbelief, half wonder. "You really think that's possible?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," he admitted. "But I know this. Some things don't end when people leave. They just change shape." Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutters. A few minutes later, Lily got up and began to hang the sketches along the wall, one by one. Daniel watched as she turned the kitchen into something resembling a small gallery. Each piece caught the light differently, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel hollow. When she reached the last drawing, the portrait of the two boys on the fence, she paused. "Was this before he left?" Daniel nodded. "The day before. He said he needed to go find something he'd lost. I thought he meant his art." He looked down, his voice cracking. "But maybe it was himself." Lily turned back to the wall, her eyes glistening. "Maybe he found it, just not where anyone expected." Daniel looked at her then. Really looked. There was a quiet strength in her face that reminded him of her mother, and something even older, something that belonged to the land itself. He realized that for years he had been so afraid of losing her that he hadn't seen how much she had grown beyond his fear. The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly. Lily poured 2 mugs of coffee, and for a while they drank in silence, watching the sunlight shift across the floorboards. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of hooves, distant and rhythmic. Lily set her mug down. "Did you hear that?" Daniel smiled. "He's still out there." The afternoon wore on, and Daniel kept reading. April 7th. Michael had written, "I dreamt of Daniel again. He was still a boy, angry that I'd left. But in the dream, he smiled at the end. I think that means he forgave me, or maybe it means I forgave myself." Daniel closed the journal, his eyes wet. "I never got to say goodbye?" Lily reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe this is goodbye," she said softly. "And maybe that's enough." They sat like that until the light began to fade. Then Daniel stood and walked outside. The horizon was a blaze of orange and violet, the fields glowing under the setting sun. Lily followed him to the fence line, where the air smelled of grass and rain. He leaned on the fence and looked out across the land. "Your uncle once told me that a man's heart is just another kind of landscape, full of storms, rivers, and quiet places you never visit again. But if you're lucky, something wild will always find its way back." Lily smiled faintly. "Like Ghost?" He nodded. "Like Ghost." They stood together, watching as a shape appeared far off against the dying light. The horse moved slowly along the ridge, white against the orange sky, its mane rippling like silk in the wind. It paused for a moment, lifted its head, and then vanished beyond the hill. Neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The wind carried the rest, the unspoken words, the memories, the forgiveness. When they turned back toward the house, Daniel felt lighter, as if part of the weight he'd carried for years had finally lifted. Inside, the journal lay open on the table, its last page fluttering gently in the breeze from the open window. A single line stood out in the fading light. Freedom is not running away. It's returning to what still loves you. Daniel closed the window, his hand lingering on the frame. Outside, the first stars blinked into being above the plains, and the sound of the wind shifted, no longer mournful, but full of quiet promise. The next morning, the sky was clear, sharp as glass, and the fields shimmered with dew. Daniel stepped outside before sunrise, the cool air biting at his cheeks. The farm lay still, quiet, almost reverent, as if holding its breath after the storm of the past days. He could still hear Michael's words echoing in his mind. Freedom is not running away. It's returning to what still loves you. He poured coffee into a tin mug and watched the horizon blush pale orange. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man standing on the edge of losing everything. Yet a shadow remained inside him, a small, stubborn ache that even the dawn couldn't wash away. Inside, Lily was packing again. The sound of her suitcase zipper snapped through the morning silence like a whip. Daniel turned toward the door, dread tightening in his chest. "You're leaving," he said, though it wasn't a question. Lily didn't look up. "Just for a while. I got an offer in Denver, a small design firm. I told you I was sending out applications." He stared at her, confused. "I thought you said you wanted to stay, that we'd fix this place together." "I did," she said softly. "But that was before I realized. Maybe I was just trying to fix you." The words hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For a long moment, only the ticking of the old wall clock filled the room. "I can't keep pretending this land is my dream, Dad," Lily continued. "You see beauty here? I see walls. Every fence post feels like a chain." Daniel swallowed hard. "This land fed our family for 3 generations. It's where your mother's buried. It's where your uncle—" "My uncle ran away from here," she snapped, spinning around to face him. "And you act like that makes him a saint. But maybe he just couldn't breathe here either." The silence that followed was brutal. Daniel's face hardened, years of weariness gathering behind his eyes. "You don't understand what it means to belong to something," he said quietly. "And you don't understand what it means to outgrow it," she shot back. She grabbed her jacket, pushing past him toward the door. Daniel reached out instinctively, his voice rough. "Lily, wait." She stopped at the threshold, her back to him. He could see the tremor in her shoulders, the hesitation. "You think I'm leaving because I don't care?" she whispered. "But I'm leaving because I can't watch you fade with this place. I can't be buried alive with it." The door closed softly behind her. Daniel stood frozen in the quiet that followed, his chest tight. Outside, the wind began to rise, tugging at the loose shingles of the barn. He felt the old panic clawing at his throat, the same panic that had haunted him the night Michael disappeared, the same emptiness that had never truly left. He walked out to the corral, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The world felt enormous and empty all at once. The morning light glimmered off the frost, turning the fields into an ocean of glass. Somewhere far beyond the tree line, a single horse's cry broke the silence, long, low, and haunting. Daniel lifted his head. There, at the edge of the woods, Ghost stood once again. Its white coat gleamed like sunlight on snow, its mane rippling in the wind. The horse took a few steps forward, then stopped, staring directly at him. Daniel exhaled shakily. "You again," he murmured. "You always show up when everything's falling apart." He climbed over the fence and began walking toward the horse. His breath came out in short clouds. Ghost didn't move. It only lowered its head, eyes calm and knowing. "I'm losing her," Daniel whispered. "Just like I lost him. Just like I lose everything." The horse flicked its ears but stayed still. For a fleeting moment, Daniel imagined it understood him, that behind those dark eyes lived something more than instinct, something human, or maybe divine. He took another step closer. "I don't know what you are," he said softly, "but every time you appear, something breaks, and something heals." A gust of wind swept across the field, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Ghost lifted its head, then turned, trotting toward the forest. It paused once at the edge, glancing back before vanishing into the trees. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where it had been. Then he turned back toward the house. The coffee on the porch had gone cold. Inside, Lily's suitcase was gone, but on the kitchen table lay something unexpected. A folded sheet of paper, weighted down by the leather-bound journal. He unfolded it with trembling hands. "Dad," the note read, "I'm not running away. I just need to find what this place means to me before I can belong to it. I'll be back when I understand. Don't stop believing that we can start over." L. Daniel sat down slowly. His vision blurred, and for a moment the world seemed to dissolve around him. The loneliness returned, sharp and familiar, but this time it carried a strange kind of peace with it. That evening, he wandered out to the fence line again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep gold and rose. The mountains loomed purple in the distance, quiet and eternal. Daniel leaned against the post, the rough wood pressing into his palms, grounding him. "I guess you were right, Michael," he said, softly. "Freedom doesn't mean running. Maybe it means letting go without losing hope." As the last light faded, he thought he heard the faint sound of hooves again. Steady, rhythmic, fading into the horizon like a heartbeat that would never stop echoing. He didn't turn around this time. He just listened. The day after Lily left, Daniel waited for the light to turn thin and blue, the kind that makes everything honest. He saddled nothing, carried nothing but a thermos and Michael's journal tucked into his coat, and set out on foot toward the tree line. The air was crisp enough to sting, but he welcomed it. A clean ache was better than the dull one that had lived in his chest for years. Behind him, the farmhouse kept its distance the way old houses do when they've heard too much. Ahead, the pines stood in patient rows, holding what he knew he had to face. By the time he reached the ridge, frost had burned off the needles and the ground gave under his boots with a quiet sigh. The path remembered him. At least that's what he told himself, curving the way a hand might close around another. He didn't look for Ghost. He had learned that some presences were truest when you didn't ask them to prove themselves. He passed the stream, the stones dark with meltwater, and climbed the last rise where the roofline of the cabin appeared, slumped but still holding. Inside, the stillness met him like an old friend who doesn't insist on talking. Dust lifted, settled, lifted again with each breath. He opened the window a little, so the room could feel the day, and the air moved across the floorboards, carrying a hint of resin and a sweetness he remembered from summers when Michael mixed linseed oil with color until the whole world seemed a shade more possible. Daniel stood for a moment with his hand on the sill, eyes closed, letting the place decide if it would have him back. He set the journal on the desk and took stock. The canvases waited along the walls, some finished, some paused mid-thought. A single chair, a kettle. The coat still hung where it always had, the shoulder threaded with sunlight. He rolled his sleeves and began with what he could touch. Swept first, gentle, slow, like he was brushing hair from a sleeping person's face. Each pass revealed a little more grain in the wood, a little more of the cabin's intention. He wiped the panes until the forest sharpened, then the table, then the shelf with the paint tubes, laying them out in a neat row, though most were dry and stubborn as stones. He made a small altar to usefulness on the desk, the sharpest pencil, the last good brush, the pocket knife with a notch in the handle. Beneath a stack of brown paper, he found a rag wrapped around something rectangular and thin. He unfolded it carefully. A board. Not canvas, just primed wood, halfway painted. He knew the place at a glance. The Brooks pasture at late afternoon, fences still straight, sky wide as a held breath. In the foreground, 2 figures sat on a fence rail. Boys. Michael had blocked them in with flat tones, hat brims, elbows, the tilt of a head toward laughter. But their faces were still only suggestions, as if he hadn't decided yet who they would become. Daniel felt the floor tilt a little and steadied himself with a hand on the desk. He set the board upright and stepped back. It wasn't nostalgia that moved through him. It was recognition, the kind that empties you out so something larger can take your place. He thought of the bank's red stamp waiting at home, the calls he avoided, the way words like mortgage refinance and home insurance had begun to sound less like lifelines and more like weather. He could feel the weight of the farm on him, even here, even now. But in the painting, the land didn't hold him down. It lifted. He found a broom handle the right height and wedged the board on a nail so it faced the window's light. He sat. Let the hush gather again. Then he opened the journal to the last third and read without rush, following Michael's days the way a hiker traces a creek, letting the water choose the turns. April 11th. There are afternoons when the light makes everything look like it remembers me. I paint until the room disappears, and the sky is only a sound the brush makes. April 12th. Tried to finish the boys. Couldn't. One of them still refuses a face. Maybe he doesn't want one I can give him. April 14th. The white horse came at dusk. He stood where the hill breaks into the meadow and watched the cabin without fear. I didn't approach. Some distances are sacred. Daniel closed the book on that line. Sacred distances. He looked from the words to the board and back. He thought of Lily's note, the way the L at the end of her name curved like a road bending out of sight. He'd told himself he understood, but the understanding hadn't yet moved from thought to bone. He cleaned the table and cleared a space to work, not to finish the painting, not yet, but to keep company with it. He unfolded a rag, found a tube that would still give him a little ochre, enough to stain a wash. He dabbed the corner, nothing decisive, just warmth near the horizon line where Michael had left the sky reaching. He spoke aloud without knowing to whom. "I'm not changing your work, brother. I'm just standing where you stood." Light shifted. A cloud passed. He listened to the roof settle and the little tick of pine cones falling outside. The cabin had its own clock, indifferent to any he'd tried to obey. Noon found him on the porch steps with the thermos, drinking coffee gone lukewarm. Across the clearing, a pine leaned in as if to hear him think. He almost laughed at himself, an old man on a step talking to trees. But it felt right, kinder than anything he'd tried to force with words. Coming back inside, he noticed a drawer he hadn't opened beneath the desk. It stuck a little, then gave. Inside, envelopes without stamps, addresses written but never sent, all to the farmhouse, all in Michael's careful hand. He didn't open them. He knew that pain. Some letters are meant to be read by air alone. He placed them back gently and slid the drawer shut, as if tucking someone in. The afternoon wore on, and a thin rain arrived, more like a blessing than weather. Each drop found the roof and spoke in its small voice. Daniel stood before the unfinished board again, seeing new things because the light told him to. In the distant pasture, the dog run Michael had sketched was too long. Daniel remembered it shorter. He ran a pencil line where memory insisted. He wasn't correcting his brother. He was meeting him halfway, across time's table. He sat back, hand stained with a quiet he hadn't known how to earn until now. The faces in the painting were still unspoken, and he let them remain that way. Some truths keep their power by not being named. He felt the ache in his chest loosen a little, not because grief had left, but because he'd let it sit where it needed to be. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The clearing wore that after-rain shine, every leaf rinsed, earth dark and satisfied. He stood on the threshold and let his eyes adjust to the soft brightness. That's when he saw it. Movement at the far edge of the trees. Not a flash. Not a miracle, only the most ordinary thing in the world. A horse standing still, head low, listening. "Ghost," he said, almost smiling. He didn't move toward it. He was learning the discipline of distance, the shape of reverence. The horse raised its head as if acknowledging the lesson, then turned sideways, showing the line of its shoulder, the clean hinge of muscle where power gathers before it becomes motion. It stayed like that, a white mark against the dark, until a breeze lifted through the clearing and the branches filled with a softer sound, the sound of approach. Footsteps, careful on wet ground. He turned. Lily stood just beyond the porch, hair damp from rain, a backpack darkened with water at the seams. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. He saw the city in the way she held herself, forward, taut, and he saw the child in the way she didn't hide the relief flooding her eyes. "I made it as far as Missoula," she said, breathless with the simple truth of it. "The road was full of billboards telling me 100 ways to fix my life. Credit cards, car insurance, even an online degree. I kept thinking how loud the world gets when you're trying to be brave." She looked past him into the cabin. "Then I remembered the quiet here, the kind that listens back." He didn't trust his voice. He stepped aside, and she came up the porch, pausing at the doorway like he had that morning. When she crossed into the room, the air changed the way it does when a missing shape returns to its outline. Lily took in the canvases, the window's new clarity, the board on the nail. She moved closer and stopped. Her hand rose as if to touch the unpainted faces, then fell. "You found more," she said. I found enough, he answered. Her eyes softened. So did I. They stood shoulder to shoulder, neither pressing for forgiveness, neither offering it like a coin. Outside, the last drops fell from the eaves in even intervals, as if marking time until the light went gold again. Daniel felt the day turn, not with any grand announcement, but with the quiet surety of a gate swinging true on old hinges. He didn't say stay. She didn't say I will. Some distances are sacred. Some aren't anymore. He lifted the journal from the desk and put it in her hands. Read to me, he said. Start anywhere. She opened to a page he didn't remember. April 9th. If I ever finish The Boys on the Fence, it won't be because I decided their faces. It'll be because they decided their own. Lily looked up. The cabin seemed to nod, the way places do when the right sentence is finally spoken aloud. Daniel turned to the window. The edge of the clearing was empty now, but he knew better than to think absence meant loss. The forest was full of white places where a horse could be, and you wouldn't see it. Like memory, like mercy. Tomorrow, he said, and the word felt new in his mouth. We'll bring the rest home. She nodded. Tomorrow. They listened to the cabin breathe. Nothing happened. Everything had changed. The next morning began without sound, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what they would do. The light filtered through the pines in soft gold bands that touched the cabin walls, revealing the dust still floating in the air from the day before. Daniel awoke in the old chair by the window, Michael's journal still open on his lap. Outside, the forest exhaled a thin mist, and the scent of wet pine drifted through the cracked door. Lily was already up. She moved around quietly, setting water to boil on the old stove, her movements slow, careful, as if not to disturb the calm that had finally settled over them. When she noticed Daniel stirring, she offered a small, tired smile, one that carried apology and peace all at once. Coffee's almost ready, she said. He nodded, rubbing his eyes. You stayed. I told you I would, she replied simply, at least for now. The steam from the kettle began to hum, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence was no longer heavy. It was companionable, the kind that feels like understanding. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The clearing shimmered with dew. The world washed clean. The path leading down from the ridge was still damp from last night's rain, and small rivulets of water ran between stones. Lily looked toward the forest's edge where Ghost had last stood. You think he's still out there? She asked. Daniel followed her gaze. He always is. You just don't always need to see him to know. Lily smiled faintly. You sound like a preacher. Just a tired man learning to listen, he said. They returned inside, and Lily began packing the paintings Michael had left unfinished. She handled each one as though it were fragile skin, her uncle's presence pressed into the canvas. One painting in particular caught her attention, a field of wild grass with a single figure standing at the horizon, faceless, waiting. She traced her fingers along the brushstrokes and whispered, He painted loneliness beautifully. Daniel looked up from the desk. He didn't paint loneliness, he said. He painted hope that forgot what it looked like. She turned to him then, and there was something new in her eyes, a kind of quiet awakening, a recognition of everything her father had carried, everything she had misjudged. She set the canvas down and crossed to the desk. You never stopped trying, did you? For what? To keep this place alive, she said. even when it stopped loving you back. He shook his head slowly. The land never stopped loving me. I just forgot how to listen to it. For the first time in years, Lily didn't roll her eyes or argue. She looked around the cabin, the brushes, the dust, the half-finished dreams, and felt the weight of it all settle into her chest, not as a burden, but as belonging. That afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the clearing like spilled honey. Daniel began loading the truck with the canvases and Michael's journal, wrapping them in cloth to protect from the wind. Lily helped, her movements purposeful. "We'll bring them to town," he said. "Let people see what he left behind. Let them remember him." She hesitated. What if they don't care? It's been so long. Daniel tightened the rope around the bundle. "Then at least we tried. That's all any of us can do. Try to keep someone's name from fading." They worked in silence for a while. As they prepared to leave, Lily stopped by the doorway and turned back to the cabin one last time. "It feels wrong to just leave it like this," she murmured. Daniel followed her gaze. The light inside had turned warm and amber, illuminating the floating dust like gold flecks in the air. "It won't be empty," he said. "Places like this remember. Every nail, every brushstroke. It'll keep him company." The road down from the ridge was rough, the tires sliding in the mud left by the rain. Lily drove, her hands steady on the wheel. The forest thinned, opening into the valley, and the world widened into open plains. The sky stretched unbroken, a vast dome of pale blue. For the first time in weeks, Daniel rolled down the window and let the wind fill the truck. The smell of earth, pine, and something freer. Halfway through the valley, they stopped by a shallow creek. The water shimmered like glass, and small white wildflowers grew along the banks. Lily stepped out first, taking in the quiet. "I used to hate this silence," she said. "Now it feels like it's trying to tell me something." Daniel smiled. "It always has. You just had to grow quiet enough to hear it." She crouched, touching the cold water. The reflection rippled, her face blurred, then sharpened again. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a pale shape behind her, something white and graceful moving through the trees. When she blinked, it was gone. She stood and looked toward her father. "Maybe I was wrong," she said softly. "Maybe staying isn't the same as giving up." He nodded. "And maybe leaving isn't the same as running away." They climbed back into the truck, and as the engine started, the faint rhythm of hooves echoed somewhere in the distance, not close but not far either. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the light had begun to fade, brushing the sky with orange and rose. The air smelled faintly of rain on asphalt and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Daniel parked by the old community hall, a place that had hosted weddings, funerals, and now, perhaps, a memory of Michael Brooks. Lily stepped out first. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden steps. Inside, the air was cool and hollow. Dusty banners from forgotten festivals hung limp from the rafters. Yet beneath it all, there was space. Space for something new to be remembered. Daniel carried the first bundle inside and set it down with care. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll hang them. Let the town see who he was." Lily looked around the room, eyes wide with thought. "And who we are because of him," she added. Daniel met her gaze and smiled, not the tired smile of a man surviving, but the kind that belongs to someone finally starting to live again. Exactly that. They turned off the lights and stepped outside. The last edge of daylight lingered on the horizon, and for a moment, the world was still. Then, faint and fleeting, the cry of a horse echoed across the plains, soft, wild, and infinite. Lily looked toward the sound, her voice barely above a whisper. He's still watching. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. Always. And as the wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of earth and memory, they began the quiet walk back to the truck. Two silhouettes against the fading sun, no longer running from the past, but walking beside it. By dawn, the town still slept beneath a veil of mist, its rooftops beaded with dew, its streets quiet, except for the hum of an early wind rolling down from the Bitterroot Mountains. Daniel loaded the last of Michael's paintings into the back of the pickup, tying down the canvas bundles with rope. The old truck groaned as though it remembered every mile it had carried his family. Lily emerged from the community hall with a thermos of coffee and a folded map, her cheeks flushed from the chill. "Forecast says we'll have rain before evening," she said. Daniel looked up at the sky. "Rain's never stopped us before." She smiled faintly. It has a habit of trying. They set off just after sunrise. The road wound through the valley, climbing gently between the hills, the world widening with every turn. The truck rattled, the engine coughing like an old man clearing his throat, but the sound was almost comforting. A reminder that some things, though fragile, still hold. Lily rolled down her window, letting the wind whip through her hair. "You ever think Uncle Michael would have wanted this?" she asked. "All of it? His paintings? His name back in town?" Daniel thought for a moment. He didn't paint for people. He painted because he had to. But I think he'd want his story told. Not for pride, for peace. They drove in silence after that, the road stretching like a ribbon of memory. Fields of amber grass swayed under the early sun, and far in the distance, the snow-capped peaks shimmered like ghosts of another season. By midday, the sky began to change. The light dimmed, the air thickened, and clouds rolled down from the mountains, slow and heavy, the color of lead. A rumble of thunder echoed, low and uncertain at first, then closer, louder. "Maybe we should turn back," Lily said, glancing at the sky. Daniel shook his head. "We're almost there. The hall's ready. Let's finish this." But the storm came faster than he expected. Within minutes, the wind picked up, bending the tall grasses flat. The first drops of rain hit the windshield like thrown pebbles, then came harder, blinding. The truck wobbled as Daniel fought the wheel. "Dad!" Lily shouted over the roar of rain. "Pull over! You'll ruin the paintings!" He squinted through the downpour. "There's an old barn up ahead, just a few hundred yards. We'll wait it out there." The world turned gray and frantic. The wipers slapped uselessly, the tires skidding over the slick road. Through the blur of water, Daniel spotted a shape. The outline of a weathered barn on the side of a hill, half collapsed but still standing. He turned the wheel hard, guiding the truck off the road and up the muddy incline. The wheels spun, throwing up brown spray, but somehow they made it to the barn. They jumped out, soaked within seconds, and threw open the large wooden doors. The air inside smelled of old hay and rust, but it was dry. Daniel backed the truck halfway in and cut the engine. For a while, they just stood there, catching their breath, listening to the storm rage outside, thunder cracking, wind howling through the cracks in the boards. Lily brushed the wet hair from her face and laughed. a small, disbelieving sound. Guess nature wanted its own audience. Daniel chuckled softly, wringing water from his sleeve. Montana never lets you forget who's in charge. They checked the paintings, all safe, though damp at the edges. Daniel sat down on an overturned crate, his breath visible in the chill. Funny, he said. I used to think storms were punishment, reminders that I couldn't control anything. But now, I think they're just a way of telling us we're still alive. Lily sat beside him, hugging her knees. You always find poetry in everything. He shrugged. I learned it from your uncle. He said a storm is just the sky trying to feel something again. The thunder rolled again, shaking the barn's beams. Lightning flashed, bright enough to turn the world white for an instant, and in that brief light, through a gap in the door, Lily saw movement across the valley. A white shape, running against the wind. Dad, she whispered. Look. Daniel followed her gaze. There, streaking across the open field, mane flying like a banner, was Ghost. The rain blurred its form, turning it half myth, half real. For a moment, it climbed a small rise, silhouetted against the lightning, then stopped and faced them. It's him, Daniel said softly. He always comes when the world breaks open. They watched in silence. Ghost stood there, unflinching in the storm, the wind whipping around him. Then, slowly, he turned and trotted along the ridge, leading toward the far end of the valley. He's showing us something, Lily said. Or reminding us of something, Daniel murmured. That we're not done yet. When the storm finally began to fade, the rain eased into a whisper. The clouds tore apart, revealing patches of sky the color of ash and silver. A single beam of sunlight broke through, landing squarely on the barn doors. Lily stood, her voice quiet. You know, I used to think storms were endings, but maybe they're just the world's way of washing things clean. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe that's what forgiveness sounds like. They stepped outside. The air was sharp and new, the ground steaming where the rain met the warmth of the earth. In the distance, the ridge was empty now. Ghost gone again, leaving only tracks that the rain hadn't quite erased. They stood there, watching the last drops fall. Then Lily reached for her father's hand. Let's finish this, she said. For him, for us. He squeezed her hand, his voice low but certain. For all of us. They climbed back into the truck, the tires sinking into the soft mud before finding grip. The sun pushed through the thinning clouds, bathing the valley in pale gold. The road ahead gleamed wet and alive, winding toward town. Neither of them spoke as they drove. They didn't need to. The storm had said enough. By the time they reached the first row of houses, the sky had cleared completely. The light after the rain was pure, almost tender, wrapping the world in a quiet grace. Daniel parked in front of the community hall, stepping out into puddles that reflected the evening sun. Lily smiled, turning her face toward the light. Looks like the storm made room for something better. Daniel looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting apart. Always does, he said. They began unloading the paintings, their clothes still damp, their hearts strangely light. The storm had not stopped them. It had remade them. The morning after the storm broke clear and dazzling, as if the world itself had been freshly washed. Puddles mirrored the Montana sky, and the distant peaks gleamed white with new snow. The air smelled of wet grass, pine, and a hint of wood smoke drifting from town. Daniel stood outside the community hall, sleeves rolled up, his hands still rough with the work of carrying in the paintings. Lily, hair tied back, was already inside arranging them on the walls, humming softly. A tune neither of them quite recognized, but that somehow belonged there. The hall was small, its floorboards scuffed and uneven, its windows fogged with age. But as the canvases went up one by one, the space began to change. Michael's colors, deep ochres, endless blues, the clean white of mountain light, transformed the dusty room into something almost sacred. The largest painting, the unfinished one of the two boys on the fence, was placed in the center. Lily stood back, studying it in the morning light. "It doesn't feel unfinished anymore," she said. "It feels like it's still breathing." Daniel stepped beside her. Maybe that's what he wanted, for someone to stand here, years later, and keep it alive. They worked in silence for a while, hanging the last of the sketches and straightening the frames. The townspeople had promised to come at noon. Old friends, neighbors, the few who still remembered the Brooks family name without bitterness or pity. Daniel didn't expect a crowd. He only wanted the quiet kind of remembrance, the kind that lingers after everyone goes home. When the church bell in the square struck 12, the first visitors arrived. Mrs. Dalton, who used to teach the local art class, walked in with her cane tapping the floor. Behind her came Tom Miller from the feed store, a couple of ranch hands, and a few curious teenagers. They entered hesitantly at first, whispering as if afraid to disturb the room. But then, one by one, they stopped speaking altogether. The paintings did the talking. A murmur of recognition spread through the hall, the way people react when they see not just art, but memory. "That's our valley," someone whispered. "That's the bridge by Miller Creek." An old man pointed at a canvas of a storm over the bitterroots and said, "He caught the wind right. You can almost feel it." Daniel stood near the back, his hands in his pockets, watching. He didn't need to speak. For years he had believed his brother's story had ended in failure. A man who vanished, leaving behind only silence. But now, that silence was breaking in the most gentle way possible. Through color, through shared breath, through eyes that lingered a little too long on a painted sky. Lily moved among the crowd, answering questions, telling bits of what they had found. "We discovered his cabin up in the ridge," she said to a woman clutching her coat. "He was painting right up until the end. He never stopped." The woman wiped her eyes. "Then he didn't die alone. He lived." Lily nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, he lived." Daniel caught fragments of conversation drifting through the hall, words like freedom, forgiveness, beauty. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting them wash over him. Then a voice called his name. "Daniel Brooks," said Mrs. Dalton, her cane thudding lightly on the floor. "You tell me, did he ever know how good he was?" Daniel hesitated, then smiled faintly. "He didn't paint to be good," he said. "He painted to remember who he was. I think, in the end, that was enough." She nodded, her eyes glimmering. "That's all art ever is, remembering." When the crowd thinned, Lily approached him. "They want to know if we're keeping the paintings here or bringing them back home." Daniel looked around the hall, the light falling across the wooden floor, catching on the golds and greens of Michael's landscapes. "We'll leave them here," he said after a long pause. "This town deserves to keep what it forgot." Lily smiled. "Then let's give it back to them." They spent the afternoon labeling each piece, writing short notes about the dates and locations. On one small card beneath the unfinished painting, Lily wrote, "The Brooks Brothers, 1978, completed by time itself." She taped it beneath the frame, her handwriting steady. As the day waned, the hall grew quiet again. The last visitors left, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. The sun slanted through the tall windows, bathing the paintings in amber light. Dust motes drifted lazily, catching the glow. Tiny stars in a small universe. Daniel sat on the edge of the stage, staring at the unfinished painting. The brushstrokes seemed to move with the changing light, the faces of the boys half hidden, half formed. "You know," he said, "for years I thought my brother ran away from home. But now I see he was running toward something I couldn't see back then." Lily sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "And what about you?" she asked. He thought for a moment, watching the last of the light fade across the canvas. "Maybe I was the one who ran. I just stayed in one place while I did it." She smiled, the kind of smile that comes from recognition, not comfort. "Guess we both found our way back then." Outside, the world had turned quiet again. The wind moved gently through the open door, carrying the scent of rain-soaked grass. From somewhere beyond the hills came the faint, rhythmic sound of hooves, distant, steady, like a heartbeat against the horizon. Daniel turned toward the sound and whispered, "He's still watching." Lily followed his gaze. "Ghost?" He nodded. "Or Michael. Maybe both." The sound faded, leaving only the hum of the evening air. Daniel stood and turned off the lights one by one until only the glow from the window remained. The last beam of sunlight fell across the unfinished painting, igniting the horizon line in a brief flare of gold before it dimmed. Lily looked around the hall, the walls alive with color, the air thick with stories that would now outlive them both. "It's strange," she said quietly. "It doesn't feel like an ending." Daniel placed his hat over his heart and smiled. "That's because it isn't." They stepped outside together, locking the hall behind them. The sky was a deep, bruised violet, the first stars beginning to appear. Down the empty main street, the lights of the diner flickered on, and the smell of coffee and rain drifted through the air. Lily slipped her arm through her father's as they walked toward the truck. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we'll start again." He looked at her, his eyes warm and steady. "Tomorrow," he echoed. And behind them, in the quiet hall now filled with the spirit of memory, the last echo of hooves crossed the valley one final time, not in farewell, but in blessing. The drive back from town was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't ask for filling. The headlights carved soft tunnels through the fog as the truck wound along the dirt road leading home. Lily leaned her head against the window, watching the reflections of distant stars shimmer in the puddles on the roadside. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the scent of wet earth still clung to the air like an echo. Daniel's hands rested loose on the wheel, his gaze steady ahead. He looked older in the passing light, not from exhaustion, but from release. He had spent years carrying a burden that had no shape and no name. Tonight, it felt as though it had finally taken flight. They reached the farm close to midnight. The house stood small but welcoming against the silver-gray sky, the porch lamp flickering as if it too had waited up for them. Daniel cut the engine, and the night filled with the soft hum of crickets and the distant rush of wind sweeping down from the mountains. Lily stepped out first, her boots crunching over gravel. She tilted her head toward the sky, the stars bright enough to touch. "It feels different here," she said. Daniel joined her, hands in his pockets. "Maybe it's not the place that changed," he murmured. "Maybe we did." They unpacked the last few items from the truck. Not the paintings, but Michael's journal, a few sketches, and one small frame Lily insisted on keeping. Inside, the house was dim and cool. Daniel set the frame on the mantel, a painting of the meadow at dawn, unfinished like so much of Michael's work, but radiant in its incompleteness. Lily lit a lamp and smiled. "You know, it almost feels like he's still here." Daniel nodded. Maybe he is. Maybe this was his way of coming home. They didn't speak much after that. Lily wandered through the rooms, touching the old furniture, the windows, the things that once felt like cages, but now seemed to breathe. Daniel sat by the fire, feeding it with small bits of dry wood until the flames steadied. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing through the grass with a sound that was almost like breathing, the slow, rhythmic exhale of the earth itself. Lily came to sit beside him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "When I was a kid, I used to hate how quiet it was out here. I thought it meant nothing ever happened. But maybe all the important things happen in silence." Daniel smiled faintly. "The silence teaches you how to listen. That's what your uncle used to say." She turned to look at him, eyes warm in the firelight. "And what do you hear now?" He thought for a moment, the flames dancing in his gaze. "I hear peace," he said, "and the sound of something beginning again." For a long while, they sat together without words, listening to the wind move through the fields. Then Lily stood, wrapped her arms around herself, and said, "Tomorrow, I want to ride out past the ridge. I want to see where he lived, one last time. Maybe plant something there, a marker, maybe a wildflower." Daniel nodded slowly. "We'll do it together." The next morning, the sun rose in soft gold ribbons over the mountains. The world felt clean, renewed, the air bright and sharp with the scent of pine and melted snow. Daniel saddled the old mare. Not Ghost, but a chestnut horse from the ranch nearby that Lily had started training again. They rode through the fields quietly, the rhythm of the horse's gait blending with the soft sigh of the wind. The mountains loomed closer, their peaks veiled in morning mist. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the light had deepened, filtering through the trees in streaks of amber. The cabin appeared slowly between the trunks, smaller than they remembered, but no less sacred. Time had softened it, turned the wood a deep gray, but it still stood. The door creaked as Daniel pushed it open, and the smell of pine and old paint welcomed them like an embrace. Lily unpacked a small canvas from her saddlebag, a piece she had painted the week before, secretly. It showed the ridge at dusk, a white horse on the horizon, and two figures standing beside it. She set it on the windowsill, just where the light would fall across it each morning. "This is for him," she said softly. "So he's never alone again." Daniel looked at the painting, his throat tightening. "You've got his hand," he said, "and your mother's heart." Lily smiled. "And your stubbornness." They stepped back outside. The wind stirred the trees, the world humming quietly. Daniel took a small bag of wildflower seeds from his coat pocket. Mountain asters, his brother's favorite. He scattered them near the steps, the seeds catching the light as they fell. Lily knelt beside him, pressing her fingers into the soil. "He'll like that," she said, something alive growing from what he left behind. He nodded. "That's how we all stay, I think. Not in stone or memory, but in what we leave that keeps living." They stood together, watching the breeze lift through the clearing. The sky above the mountains had turned a deep, luminous blue. For a brief moment, the air shimmered, and in that shimmer, Daniel thought he saw a pale figure moving along the tree line, the flicker of white against the green, too graceful to be the wind alone. Lily saw it too. "Ghost," she whispered. The horse paused, head lifted, mane catching the light like spun silver. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, it turned and trotted toward the ridge, fading into the sunlit mist. Neither of them moved. The moment held, suspended in the hush that followed. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice soft. "He came to say thank you." Lily smiled through her tears. "Or maybe goodbye." He shook his head gently. "No, not goodbye. Just see you when the mountains breathe again." They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, the wildflower's seeds now scattered across the soil, waiting for rain. Then they mounted their horse and began the slow ride home. The wind followed them down the path, warm and alive, carrying with it the scent of pine, earth, and something eternal. Back at the farmhouse, the porch creaked under their steps, the same way it always had. Daniel looked out toward the horizon, the mountains glowing in the late morning light. For the first time in years, he felt no weight, no ghosts that needed chasing, only gratitude. Lily leaned against the porch rail, her face calm. "Do you think the seeds will grow?" she asked. He smiled. "If the mountains are kind, they will." She looked toward the ridge, where the sky seemed to touch the earth, and whispered, "They always are." And as the wind stirred the fields below them, it sounded almost like a breath, the quiet, steady exhale of a land at peace, finally remembering how to live again. Evening came with the kind of light that seemed to forgive everything it touched. The plains stretched wide and endless under a sky, washed in gold and violet, the air trembling with the faint hum of crickets. Daniel stood on the porch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, while Lily painted quietly nearby, her easel set on the grass, where the wind moved through her hair like water. Behind them, the farmhouse glowed with the warmth of a life finally reclaimed. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and still, their peaks fading into clouds. Between the last rays of sunlight and the first breath of night, the world felt perfectly balanced, as if it, too, were holding its breath. Daniel took a long sip, watching Lily's brush move with the confidence of someone who had learned to listen to silence. "You're getting faster," he said softly. She smiled without looking up. "I'm not painting faster," she replied. "I'm just not afraid to start anymore." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "That's half the battle." They stayed like that for a long while, father and daughter wrapped in the slow rhythm of evening. A hawk drifted across the sky, its shadow passing over the field like a memory. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the faint echo of running water reached them, the creek that fed the land back to life each spring. When Lily finally put her brush down, she stepped back and studied her work. The painting showed the meadow behind the house, bathed in the glow of sunset. But there, near the horizon, she had added a small white figure, a horse standing alone, its mane rippling like light. Daniel noticed and smiled. You couldn't resist. She shrugged. He belongs there. He always did. He walked over to see the painting up close. The brushwork was looser now, freer, the strokes breathing instead of straining. You found your hand, he said quietly. I found yours too, she answered. He looked at her, pride and tenderness mixing in his eyes. You know, your uncle used to say every painting should have a horizon, something the heart can chase, even if the body never reaches it. Lily nodded. Then this one's ours. They carried the canvas inside as the light faded. The house smelled of cedar and fresh bread. A small radio murmured an old country tune in the background. Daniel hung the painting above the fireplace, next to Michael's unfinished piece. The two horizons facing each other, like brothers who had finally learned to speak again after years of silence. When the stars came out, they took their coffee and stepped back outside. The wind had softened, brushing the tall grass in waves. Somewhere far off, a single light blinked near the ridge, the cabin's window reflecting the moon. Lily pointed toward it. Do you ever think he knew? That we'd find him? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. I think he painted that cabin knowing someone would. Maybe not us, maybe not even family, but someone who needed to remember what it feels like to come home. The moon climbed higher, silvering the fields. The air held a kind of stillness that felt alive, as though the land itself were breathing in rhythm with them. Daniel set his cup down on the porch rail and said, When I was your age, I used to think the horizon was a place, somewhere you could reach if you just kept moving. Now I think it's something you carry with you, a promise that tomorrow will still have room for you in it. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder. And what if it doesn't? He smiled. Then you make one. They sat like that for a long time, the wind threading through their quiet. The world around them shimmered with that strange calm that comes only after grief has finally made peace with love. Out in the distance, movement caught their eye, faint like a mirage. A pale shape glided through the meadow, unhurried, graceful. Ghost. The horse moved slowly toward the horizon, its mane glowing beneath the moonlight. It didn't look back. It didn't need to. Both of them watched in silence as it climbed the ridge, the white of its coat fading into the starlit sky. When the horse disappeared, the stillness that followed wasn't empty. It was whole. Daniel exhaled, a sound half sigh, half prayer. He's where he belongs now. Lily nodded, her eyes glistening. So are we. A soft breeze stirred the wheat, carrying the scent of rain and the first whisper of spring. Daniel stood, stretching his back, and looked out across the plains one last time. The world looked vast again, not lonely, but endless. He turned to his daughter. Tomorrow we'll start mending that north fence, maybe plant some trees by the creek. This land still has a few stories left in it. She grinned. I'll paint them when they grow. He laughed, the sound rich and easy, echoing across the open field. Deal. As they walked back inside, the stars burned bright overhead, scattered like paint across a dark canvas. Daniel paused at the door, taking one final look at the ridge, the same ridge where everything had begun. He whispered into the wind, barely louder than breath, "Thank you, brother." Then he closed the door. Inside, the lamp cast a warm glow over the two paintings above the hearth, Michael's and Lily's, their horizons meeting in eternal conversation. Outside, the mountains seemed to sigh, their long, slow breath rolling down through the valley, carrying with it the quiet truth that life, even after loss, keeps finding ways to begin again. If this story touched something deep in you, that quiet place where love, loss, and hope still breathe, then tell me in the simplest way. Comment 0 if it made you remember someone you miss, or 1 if it made you believe in second chances again. And if you want to keep walking beside me through more stories like this, where people and animals heal each other in ways words can't explain, then don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be the one that finds you.